What's up, guys? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today I'm joined by an extremely special guest, bass fishing legend Rick Clunn. Rick, thanks for joining me for the podcast today.
It's absolutely a pleasure, Johnny. We go back a long ways.
A long ways. How long? I think I met you when I was 9 years old, so over 15 years ago.
And it was almost every year at the Classic after that for years, and then you disappeared for a while, and it was kind of a sad time, but now you're back, and that's good.
Yeah, Rick's been an amazing mentor for me over the years, both in the fishing industry and just in fishing. And obviously, I've looked up to him my whole career as a fisherman, through watching him in the Bassmaster Classics, through his continued career on the Elite Series, and just recently kicking butt over on the St. Johns River and all over the place. And so, what I want to talk to Rick about today is just some topics that I've had my preconceived notions on over the years. And I have my limited experience, 25 years on this earth, but I feel like I don't have a complete picture from a tournament perspective, from a fishing perspective, a life experience perspective. And I want to get your input on my theories and see what maybe I have correct, I might have wrong, and how we can maybe work together to build even stronger theories.
And vice versa, because I've been around long enough to know that time changes everything, and I've had to reevaluate and reanalyze so much of what I've done, and amazingly a lot of it is still very applicable, but there's a lot of it that I go, whoops, I need to change that a little bit.
For sure. Well, the topic that I wanted to start discussing with Rick today is basically, what is the importance of finding a secret bait versus finding a secret area when you're fishing in a tournament or just for fun? So kind of preface that, like finding a bait that no one else is throwing and maybe throwing in areas that everyone's fishing, versus finding an area that no one knows about, or that no one's maybe, or a few people are fishing, where you can just fish, whatever baits and catch fish.
That's one of those things that's changed quite a bit in modern day fishing. I used to really look hard for the secret area, because obviously the fish aren't pressured. Most of the time they're easier to catch because I haven't seen a lot of artificial lures thrown at them. And I was successful at doing that occasionally, but even back in the early days, it didn't happen very often. The one that will always stick with me, that was a secret area, was when I won the Classic at Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1984. And you say, well, how do you know it was a secret area? Well, you usually find out after it was over, and I dominated the tournament with 75 pounds for 3 days. And it was a July and August event on a river, the Arkansas River. And the locals come up to me after it was over and said if they hadn't watched me catch them, they would have thought I cheated. And I go, well, what do you mean? And they go, well, because nobody ever fished that spot, and a few people that did never caught anything. And so they really was a lot of the real good locals would come up and tell me that, and so you knew you had found a special spot. And the lure is not quite as important if you find those kind of fish, but yet you still got to use the right tool, and that's where we get a lure confused with the proper tool. I still had to have the right tool to work this little ledge with where these fish were sitting. In other words, I had to be able to come out, dig the bottom, bounce off the ledge, and the fish would hit it. If I'd been reeling a topwater across it, I may have never got to strike in July and August. So that's where the lure does play a big role, and even with the secret fish. And certainly in modern times, it plays even a bigger role because these fish see lures every day, most of the time. And in modern times too, I am almost of the theory now, unless you're going to another country, that you can't find those kind of spots anymore. And you say, well, why? Well, because first of all, the information age is fishing is just, there are no real secrets. And you look at social media, and plus back then the quality of anglers on that body of water was probably a handful of guys, maybe less than 5 guys that really knew how to fish that river. Nowadays there's probably 100 guys that know how to fish that river, and there's 100 guys exchanging information, there's 100 guys exchanging GPS coordinates. And so almost every place that's ever been a fish caught now in any of these bodies of water, people know about, especially the good ones, what we now call the community hosts. So that brings up the second part of that question is how important is a secret bait? I don't buy into the secret bait. I think that's kind of like you're looking for a quick fix, you know. And I've seen a lot of guys early back in my career, they wanted to find the bait that nobody was throwing. And I'm not going to say it didn't occasionally occur, but more often than not, and I'll give you the example that I experienced in the secret bait category, that it really wasn't the bait, but it's the way you used it. Two of those baits come to my mind. The spinnerbait, number one, everybody throws, but the best spinnerbait fishermen I've known, and I can name them on one hand, had a special way of fishing it that others did not fish it. And the other one was it was the Pop-R that wasn't even being made anymore until one of my clients that I guided showed me how to fish it. And then I started buying up every one I saw traveling across the country. And I had more of them than anybody in existence, because they'd been discontinued by Rebel. But he had showed me a speed to fish a Top-R at I'd never seen. And it became a way, and I ended up eventually winning the U.S. Open out west with it. But I still kept it a secret. I did tell my brother, who was a guide on Lake Conroe. I did tell Zell Rowland, who was a guide on Lake Conroe. And Zell eventually spilled the beans when he won the BAS Super Bass at Chickamauga on it. And then it came out, Rebel brought it back, but they destroyed all their old modes, so they had to make new modes, and the new modes were incorrect. Because the lower lip, that was the key to that bait, was the lower lip. So those were kind of secret baits, but it really wasn't the lure. Everybody looked at that as just a chugger. It was the way you could present that lure to the fish that the fish did not see. You know, in both of those cases, a spinnerbait or the Rico Pop-R type bait, speed was the difference that nobody else used on them. All of us tend to have a certain way of turning a handle.
Yeah.
And especially you might do a few tricky things at first, but you're not going to do those if you don't get it by immediately. Then we start daydreaming and thinking about other things, and then we go back to that, which is usually medium speed. And so the one thing with the lures that I will tell you is more important, especially nowadays when you're on a community hose and other people are fishing them or fishing an area, would be that your presentation of that lure is going to ultimately dictate your success. And that's what happened in 2019. I was giving them a lure, that spinnerbait, which everybody owns, but I was presenting it in a way those fish really hadn't been seen. And and that makes a difference, but that's brief, because that knowledge can get out real quick, and then other people will start doing it. So that's constantly changing.
That's so interesting. It's so fascinating, because I always think about, even I'm thinking back to all the YouTube videos I make, I always talk about this is the best bait in these conditions or in this type of cover, this area. I don't spend near enough time focusing on, like when I'm reeling a crankbait, the different retrieves, or with a spinnerbait. I'm not experimenting with it, even trying to get in different depths of the water column. I might think about it while I'm on the water. I might just kind of do it naturally, but I'm not making a conscious effort to experiment with the different retrieves. And I think that that's something, for me personally, that I'm realizing I might be completely missing the boat on, is that my baits I'm already using, I might be able to use them in a completely different way to catch fish in the same areas. And it seems like simple, but at the same time, when you say it, it makes this whole new world of possibilities open up for me.
Well, and you're really using it as a tool. You know where the fish are sitting, you know that I've got to get a tool to get to those fish effectively and efficiently and stay in this so-called strike zone as long as possible. Yep. And that strike zone could be 10 feet or it could be 20 feet, or maybe it's the length of a top of a hump or something. But that's what you're doing. The one thing, again, that I try to add to it, and that's the same way with me, even in shallow water, I'm trying to pick the tool that'll work that habitat that I'm covering, grass, vegetation, brush piles, tree falls, rock, whatever it is, the most effectively, because most of the time we're hunting for the fish, okay? So you want a tool that allows you to do that efficiently. Once you really get where you're thinking around fish, then you got to start bringing in the predator-prey relationships. And what this predator, which the bass is usually the dominant predator in his water, what is governing him, especially the bigger they are, more than anything else. He's got laws he has to follow. It's kind of using an example of a lion in Africa. The law is there is not to kill the biggest buffalo in the herd. It is to pick out something that's acting strange, weak, and that's defined as weakness. If your behavior is different, then it can be defined as weakness by the predator, and that will trigger him because he's designed to remove the weak. That's what keeps him healthy, that's what keeps that herd healthy, and it's just a kind of, I call, a law of nature that he must obey. So even if he's not necessarily hungry, if you can create an erratic movement with that bait, which can be speeding up real quick, bouncing off, deflection off from something real quick, that might trigger a bite even from a fish that is not aggressively feeding at that point in time.
That's so fascinating. I mean, I've seen this happen obviously on the water, and you know, when you're reeling a crankbait, you stop it and then a fish eats it or something like that. And I know that when you're trying to fish, like let's say a stretch of laydowns with a square bill crankbait, you're trying to deflect it off the trees and things like that. But have you found that there are certain triggers for those bass that, like whether it's a pause or bouncing off a log, that will elicit the bite more often than not, or is it just experimenting with that day with those fish on that lake?
If I had to pick one, and you know there's no absolutes here, if you said, hey, I want one presentation from you think works more often than not, and then the others to trigger a strike. And you also have to kind of consider, is this a school of fish or is this an individual fish? Okay, but even for both of those, whether it's an individual fish sitting on a stump or a school of fish that is just sitting on an underwater hump, more often than not it's speed.
Really?
Yeah, my brain is always trying to understand the natural reason for that. But it's like, if it's just coming at it, you know, in slow motion or medium speed, the fish is using his senses to their absolute highest level, okay? And if you give him time to use those senses at his highest level, it may, and again, it just says that's not right. It's not right from the standpoint it's phony. It's not right because it's hurt. It's not right because it's phony. It's just not right. And so it doesn't react, where speed takes away some of that reaction time. And so it's either, and of course with the school of fish, once you get that first one too, the rest of them turn into copycats. You know, they start to get excited. Well, you know, well, individual fish, you know, that's not going to be necessarily the case. You probably catch him or don't catch him.
Well, that makes sense now why, like, my favorite bait to fire up an offshore school of fish is a big flutter spoon and a hair jig, because that bait is coming up off the bottom really fast, falling back down, and it's that quick acceleration that's probably triggering that bite, like you're saying, that instinctual bite.
Yeah, you put both together.
Yeah.
Speed and something that's hurt.
Yeah.
And that's a good point. Magical.
And man, so one thing I'm thinking about is, like, obviously with a crankbait, then when you kill it, it's going to slowly flow up to the surface. When you burn it really fast and it hits something, it slowly falls. Or same thing with a big spinnerbait with like a big Colorado blade. You hit it against an object and it slowly falls. That fleeing and then injured. I don't think I really do that enough for when I'm fishing down the bank. Even if I hit a log, I'll stop my spinnerbait. A lot of times it'll bounce off it and I'll just keep reeling it. So that's even fascinating right there. Like you're saying, with the instinctual nature, the stop and go makes sense.
Yeah, and all those again are functions of how long or when you do it or don't do it, are functions of clarity.
Yeah.
You know, functions of time of the year, cold water versus warm, hot water.
Yeah.
The pause, obviously we've learned with jerk baits in the summer, you don't want much of one, you want to keep it coming. Where in the winter that pause can be 8 or 9, 10 seconds.
Yeah. Gotcha. Wow. That's so fascinating. I don't know why just having you explain it to me has opened up my mind so much, because I feel like it's something that you hear about and you read about and you see on Bassmasters, but just the way you describe it is really opening my eyes to that. It's something I need to experiment with. I don't think a lot of anglers do that. They don't experiment with the speed of retrieve and stuff like that like they need to, maybe.
No, and again, I don't think we don't fully allow ourselves to, and it's very simple to understand the natural laws of a predator versus prey. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's easy to watch in even in the National Geographic Channel or those that, you know, it's that plays an important role in determining if that predator is going to react.
What are your thoughts then on, like, when I'm fishing a slower bait, like when you're offshore and you're dragging a worm, or you're fishing a big worm on the bottom, something like that. I know, like when you're fishing up shallow and you might be flipping a jig, I like to fish like a 1 ounce jig sometimes where it falls right past their face. But what about those times when you're just sitting that bait in front of those bass? Do you think that that's more of a feeding strike then, or is it just kind of because it's in their area and they're frustrated by it? What are your thoughts there?
Well, Johnny, you know you're playing in my weakest area now, dragging something slow. So personally, dragging something slow, you really have to, I think the fish has to be in more of a feeding mood because he's going to inspect it.
Yeah.
You know, and he's going to sit there and follow it across 10 feet across the bottom that you may never even know about.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think you get fortunate, because I've seen this myself, where even if a brim swims in there and starts to look at that bait, if you can that will just create enough competitiveness that he will eat the bait, when he really wasn't probably going to eat the bait to begin with. There's so many of those variables that you can't even see that are going on down there. Yeah. You know, competition with other bass, time. He doesn't have to eat it quickly. It's not going anywhere. You know, so that's why I say that he has to be fairly in more of a feeding mood, in my opinion, to eat a slow-moving bait. Of course, then you got the theory of the Florida guy, the dead sticking, and it just puzzles. And it puzzles me to no end. I don't understand that behavior completely, and I wish I had somebody that could explain it to me. Yeah. Is it just a Florida species behavior? Yeah. Or is it, you know, other species, other bass do the same thing? But I mean, I've had my pants beat off in Florida Okeechobee by a guy in the back that throws his bait into a patch of reeds, and I mean, I've hit 20 targets by the time he finally pulls it out of those reeds and just beat me to death that day. You know, just why? What is it just staying in there that generates the strike? Now I understand if it's on the bed, but he's not, and it could be. But how lucky you get to be able to do that all day long, to throw that invisible bed and leave it there? I don't know. So there's still unanswered questions. You know, a bunch of them.
I do like what you said though about throwing the moving baits when those fish maybe aren't as much in the feeding mood, and then you throw maybe like a jig or a worm when those bass are grouped up, there's competition. Because the way I always think about it when I'm fishing a school of fish is like, you bring your jig by the first bass and he's like, oh, that looks pretty good. You bring it by the second bass and he's like, oh, I don't want that second bass to get. And then you pull it by another one, he's like, screw these other guys, I'm gonna go grab it. And so that makes so much sense. And at the same time, it's now, I'm going to come away from this talk, Rick, with so many new ideas. This is awesome. But one thing that I'm thinking about is when you're trying to fish for an individual bass then, or maybe isolated targets, it may not be to your advantage so much to fish a bait very slowly through an area. It may actually be better, and I know you do this, and I've talked to other pros who do this, is making repeated casts to a target where you feel like there's an individual bass, because you're trying to get that reaction strike. And so maybe making 10 casts where you're reeling it quickly is better than 3 casts where you're just pitching, like let's say there's an isolated log, pitching a jig in there and you're just soaking it there for 5 minutes.
And that's why we keep fishing. That's why I keep fishing, because we also have this concept of strike zone, that it shrinks and expands constantly due to fronts and barometric pressure and all those things. And obviously, most of us think over time, my experience is that post-front, the strike zone shrinks. Bright skies, no wind, and the fish gets into a tight area. And that strike zone now is just maybe right there around his body. And if you're not doing that pitching and flipping, where they're just dissecting a brush pile or something, if you don't get in that strike zone, you don't have a chance. And then there's in the fall of the year when I noticed that you have to do that multiple cast situation. They're laying in the flats, they're waiting on shad, they're doing this, and sometimes I can go all the way around the log, and this is very consistent in the fall, and I don't completely understand to this day. It's the 9th or 10th cast with the same lure, and it's just from, maybe is it the angle that I finally, since I circled it, I found the correct angle. Did I find, again, maybe his strike zone is small, and finally I came through it. But a lot of these things, again, is trial and error. But at the same time, it's a way of generating strikes, because most of the day we're trying to generate strikes from non-participating fish. The biggest difference about the sport of fishing versus hunting or a lot of other sports is who makes the final decision to participate. Not me, not you. That fish. Yeah. He can just sit there all day long and you can do everything right. Now I'm not playing today, you know. Yeah. So it's a light. So you're trying to convince him to play, yep. And so sometimes it's a trick here and a trick here, and it works. And you got to remember those, and remember when and why and the conditions, and then maybe it'll work again for you.
So it sounds like unless you're like Paul Elias stumbling on the Alabama rig, throwing on the bridge pollings on Gunnersville, maybe the secret bait idea is a little bit overdone, maybe overhyped. It seems like it might be more of that, finding that secret retrieve, or not secret retrieve, but a different retrieve, or maybe hitting a specific target from multiple angles to determine what the bass want. That might be a better way to maybe beat the fishing pressure, let's say, versus trying to go through every bait on Tackle Warehouse and buy them up.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, I think the Alabama rig was an anomaly.
Yeah.
It wasn't just showing us a secret bait. It was showing us a behavior about big fish, especially, that we really didn't pay much attention to, and that is what they call the bait ball behavior. Mm-hmm. One shad versus a bait ball of shad. Again, the laws of conservation of energy. How much energy am I going to use to catch that one little shad, and how much energy is it going to give me in return? Versus, okay, there's a bunch of them. If I catch all of them, then my energy exerted will be justified by the energy I get back. Yeah. So I think that's the thing I learned most from so far, and there's still a lot to learn from the Alabama rig, was that bait ball concept.
And that's when I'm looking offshore, a lot of times I try to find areas where I see the bait balls and the bass together, because that makes those fish more aggressive. They're competitive against the bait balls. And so that's what when I'm offshore graphing, and like we talked about earlier, Cody Huff, when he was on Table Rock, he knows the fish are ready to go. They're ready to bite. A lot of times for me, it's when those fish are in proximity to those bait fish. And it's kind of like that idea with the Alabama rig, is they are trying to feed then. And then my thought is, any bait I put down there, if there's 20 bass in one bait ball or two bait balls, they're going to become competitive for that bait. And so in a school of fish, that makes a lot of sense. But then for those isolated fish, which is what I think that Alabama rig did a really good job of targeting, you can bring that bait that has a lot of big profile with all the bait fish in it, buy an isolated 5-pounder on the edge of a dock or something, and it will make them want to bite even if there's no competitive instinct.
Yeah, and again, I'm always trying to put a science on everything, and I don't know how successful I am at it, but again, that one individual fish under the dock is, again, he's just weighing energy used versus energy gained. And but I think and again, here's another error we make as anglers. We're constantly trying to define things by one variable. And let's get back to the bait ball. Okay, the bait ball concept is getting them excited. So then if you add to that, and which one of the ones in the bait ball might it zero in on? Well, that can be, again, one that's it's a little bit separated from the bait ball, or is that one that is kind of injured in the bait ball? And obviously, if you watch, again, we got so much available to us now, and it's mostly ocean stuff where you watch tuna or sharks or dolphins go through a huge school of bait. Their initial target going through there is not necessarily to eat them, but is to hurt some of them. And then you can see those kind of fluttering out of the huge bait ball of fish, and that's the one the other ones are coming in and just picking off like crazy. So it's really to me fascinating, but it gets back to what you and I have talked about before, is we've been studying the wrong thing for a long time. And you know how it is with most tournament anglers. I don't. If you talk to me in my early day, you talk to any of these Kevin Van Dam or any of these guys, you watch the speed them guys fish at most of the time. It's all about efficiency, and anything that breaks up that efficiency, they don't normally like. Now that's changing. We're starting to see anglers who now are willing to sacrifice cast for precision.